So the other D in the QDDR is democracy. And also going back to your first testimony to Congress, you quoted your first predecessor, Thomas Jefferson, who said, "The interest of a nation, when well understood, will be found to coincide with their moral duties." There's obviously been a lot of debate about the role of democracy and human rights. There are some critics who say that we haven't been as zealous as we need to be about those. There are some who worry that even in our own conduct of activities, including dealing with the problem of terrorism, that we're not being consistent with our moral duties. You've had a lot of chance in the Arab Spring and elsewhere to try to deal and grapple with this challenge. How do you see it, both the importance of these values and how we implement them in our foreign policy?
Well, I think that they're absolutely paramount. I think democracy and human rights is who we are as Americans, and also what we have stood for historically. But it's quite challenging to take what are heartfelt values that we care deeply about and implement them everywhere, every time that we possibly can, because there is a lot of challenges with explaining democracy to people. If you've never lived it, you have no idea how it affects you. You don't have the sort of years and years of perfecting our union that we've gone through. Democracy can mean different things to different people. And there are different forms of electoral systems, different forms of parliamentary systems that claim to be democracies. Iran claims to be a democracy. And we have to be always consistent in supporting what we think of as the underpinnings of democracy, and it's not just elections. Some people have one election one time and claim that's a democracy. So we have to constantly be urging more openness, more respect for minorities, independent judiciary, protection of the free press, the kinds of pillars of democracy that over many, many years we have learned are essential for the institutionalization of a democratic system. And when it comes to the protection of human rights, we issue an annual human rights report that tries to shine a bright light on the problems that exist around the world. And for the first time when I became secretary, I said, look, if we're going to be judging the rest of the world, we need to judge ourselves. Because otherwise people are not going to pay attention. They'll say, well, there go the Americans again, criticizing everybody else, but what about Guantanamo, and what about this, and what about that? So we have to be honest with ourselves that despite, I believe, having the greatest commitment to democracy and human rights of any nation, of any society, of any time in history, we make mistakes, we fall short of our own standards, and we have to constantly be asking ourselves what we can do better and how we should behave. And that's important for us, first and foremost, but it's also important if we're going to have credibility when we speak to the Arab Spring or other countries that are trying to formulate democracies. And, sometimes publicly criticizing a government over human rights abuses is not the best way to achieve the results you're seeking. So we have to modulate how we say what we say and when we say it and who we speak to. Because, again, otherwise you won't be able to protect the people you're trying to protect in many instances, and you may not be listened to if it just becomes a mantra, a public rhetorical mantra. It's very challenging to have those values front and center, to promote them, to implement them, to praise and criticize appropriately. But we try to do it. I think we end up in a pretty good place. There's always a lot of room for improvement, but it is very challenging. The other aspect to this is when you have human rights standards that are so foreign to other cultures. I'll give you 3 quick examples. If you're someone as I am who believes strongly in the empowerment of women and talk about the rights of women everywhere I go. I've done this now internationally for 17 years. Honestly, in a lot of places, it's just not understood. You know, of course, we take good care of our women. We don't let them out of the house so that they never get into trouble. We don't let them drive cars so that they can never be taken advantage of. So we are protecting the human rights of our women. You can imagine the conversations that I have. Or we believe that you should not be discriminating against or permitting violence against the LGBT community in your country. And in many places, in particularly Africa and Asia, that is just a totally foreign concept. I mean, the first response is, we don't have any of those here. Second response is, if we did, we would not want to have them and would want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. And it's your problem, United States of America, that you have so many of those people. So don't come here and tell us to protect the rights of people we don't have or that we don't want. And so, I mean, I call leaders and I say, you know, you've got a legislator who's just introduced a bill that calls for the death penalty against LGBT people. That's really a terrible idea. Well, we don't have any of them. They've been imported from the West, and we don't need them. I said, well, all right. Let's start at something very basic. Why do you have to kill them? Well, maybe you're right about that. We won't impose the death penalty, but they may have to go to prison. Okay, I mean, that's the kind of discussion that you have when you're talking about human rights. And it's not that people get up in the morning and say, you know, I'm against human rights. It's that from where they come on women or LGBT or minority groups, you know, you say, you know, you don't treat that minority group very well. You know, if you're talking in the Middle East sometimes, you know, take better, you know, be nicer to your Shia or your Sunni. Or please don't discriminate against your Christians. It's a very difficult conversation because it's just not been one that people have had up until now. I think it's very important we do that, but I give you this sort of flavor so that you understand we can either have a conversation and try to convince people to move in a certain direction to provide greater protection for human rights, or we can lecture at them, we can call them names, we can preach, and the lives of the people who are being discriminated against will not change. So sometimes I feel that we get criticized because we're not being as vocal or strident as some in the advocacy community would like on some of these issues. But I'm trying to save lives, and I'm trying to change attitudes. So trying to do that simultaneously is sometimes quite challenging.